Welcome everybody. I'm very glad that today we have Sumit Kelkar with us. He is one of the persons, poets, journalists, writers whose work I follow. I stalk basically. I stalk his work, and today, just on a note, today I'm very nervous because he's the one who interviews people like Ranjit Hoskote, and I'm going to be in conversation with him. So if I make any mistakes, just pardon me today. Sudhir Kelkar is a writer and photographer based in Mumbai, India. His poems and journalism has been published in journals from India and abroad. His photojournalism will soon appear in a reputed Swiss publication. Today, we have with him, he's here with his second collection of poetry, Mumbai Monochrome, which is a collection which has photographs and haibun.
Haiku,
So,
haiku.
haiku, haiku and photographs. Welcome Suhit to Pune Writers Group. And yeah, he's a brilliant fellow whose girlfriend is also imaginary. So there's a lot going on in that mind. So welcome, Suhit.
Welcome, welcome. Just so that people will take me seriously, I should divulge that the imaginary girlfriend was a stunt, a publicity stunt, which I did in order to secure a column, a humor column. Uh, so I did a number of posts saying I have an imaginary girlfriend, and then various misadventures and Facebook posts went up with the theme of the imaginary girlfriend. And then I made a series of pitches and sent them off to editors saying, listen, this is a concept, you want to commission me or what? So fingers crossed.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Any discerning editor will pick it up
Hope
really
so,
quick.
hope so. Fingers crossed. But thank you so much to Kinjal and to everybody at the Pune Writers Group for having me on for a session. And yeah, I mean, let's chat.
Okay. So the rough structure for today's session is we'll be reading a bit from Suhit's work. Then I have some questions for him, during which time I request everyone to be on mute. If you have any questions during our conversation, put them up in the chat or reserve them on your notebooks. And then when we open them up to Q&A, you can ask those questions. I will also be taking a track of the chat with Sumit's help. So yeah, I request everybody to be on mute so that we can make the most of the 2 hours we have with Suhit. The first thing that struck me even before I reached the haiku and the photographs was the essay, Unspoken Realizations. And it's standalone, that essay is something else altogether. I think there is too much to learn in that for one reading. I have been going back to it again and again. So, before we dive into the questions, may I request that we read one paragraph from that essay?
Sure.
So, Sumit, can I screen share?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
You have
yeah.
it open, yeah?
Yes, is that
Oh,
fine?
absolutely. Please. Thank you.
So, this is the paragraph I picked because I have a question in it. And so do you want to read it or do you want somebody to volunteer? Whatever.
As you please. Whatever is the custom here.
Swati, can you read it?
A couple of months back, I posted a photo that is not a part of this book to the popular website named Reddit. The photo was liked by a number of people there. What lodged itself in my mind, though, was the comment of a Redditor who said my gaze was that of an alien who was roaming Mumbai in his UFO. The comment struck me as rude, but also perceptive. Though made perhaps in an offhand mood, it hit home with me and made me introspect. As a few days passed, I grudgingly saw the insight in this statement. It struck me that I am, in fact, particularly attuned to the strangeness of mundane life. Or perhaps the strangeness lies not out there, but in my gaze and perspective, which makes the familiar look unfamiliar, recontextualizing it, or removing context for the most part. There is, of course, more to my work than that, as there is to any photographer's work, but the fundamental point made by the Redditor stands.
Can you continue reading till the end of the paragraph?
My photography underlines the strange in the everyday, the unfamiliar in the familiar, as if I were looking at it for the first time. Isn't it one of the functions of art to spur you to look at the everyday world with a new gaze? If that is what I've succeeded in doing through my photography, I consider myself fortunate.
Thank you, Swati. Sumit, the question I had was, you speak of context in this paragraph. And so, how important is context or recontextualization? Because we often hear the hype that there needs to be a distance between objectivity and your creative product. So, can you share a little bit about how important is the context?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And also particularly for me, because I was trained as a journalist. So the word objectivity, is a very loaded word, particularly in the context of my professional practice. Uh, and objectivity is a word which is now falling or has fallen out of favor in most creative and, well, most creative disciplines, because I'm not an anthropologist or a sociologist. They will be able to go into the history of it very deeply. But objectivity has a certain colonial and a certain skewed dynamic to it. Objectivity comes from the very, very cold and impersonal uh, scientific impulse uh, to observe, to measure, to predict, and to control. That is those are the four agendas of science, right? You observe something, which means you define it, you measure it, you apply the objective measurement to it, empirical measurement to it, so that you can predict it, test your theory by predicting it, and then you can control it. So objectivity comes from that ethos, at least to my mind. And many practitioners will agree that objectivity is not at all, to a very large extent, it is simply an unattainable abstraction, because you are always coming at everything from a personal context. You whatever the self is, and this is, I'm not a philosopher, but you are a conception, you are a series of intellectual conceptions and other stuff, right? So you're always subjectively approaching everything. Now the problem with photojournalism was that it attempted to be objective, so-called objective. But for most of the photojournalistic corporations, which are corporations, they're precisely that, objectivity meant not taking a stance, not upsetting the apple cart, not questioning the status quo, So that was precisely the opposite of what was claimed, because that itself was a stand. It was a subjective call. So I'm glad you raised this issue, which is objectivity. And for a long time, I struggled with it. And as a journalist, and unfortunately then as a aspiring writer, I tried to be objective, which meant that I tried to create a sort of compartmentalization between what I was writing and what I was feeling. So you try to get yourself out as much as possible from what you're writing. And as you're all writers, so you know what happened, you know what will happen if you do that. Your writing or your whatever you do will become sterile. So then I began to question what objectivity means. And now I have abandoned that concept in favor of a shifting sort of a collection of lenses through which, as the situation demands, I look at something. So to relate this to your question, the context is a particularity which depends on the situation, right? And it is not objective. Having said that, when you stop being objective, you are free, you become more playful, right? But you also become more compassionate and sympathetic to what it is you're looking at, because you're not trying to measure it as if it were a subject, a rat in a lab. You're looking at it free of that sort of dynamic. At least that is the way it can be. So these photos are basically that, you are recontextualizing stuff. And the mere act of taking a photo is doing that. The mere act of taking a photo is very subjective, because reality is three-dimensional. Your photo is two-dimensional. Reality comes in infinite colors, which you cannot see also. And the camera reduces them further according to its algorithm, according to its optics. So you are not objective. You cannot by definition be objective when you are a photographer. When you begin to think like that, your only concern is, how do I tell this in a way, or how do I take this photo, or how do I write this poem in a way which will not distort beyond recognition what I truly feel. Right? So now you begin to look at photos and poems as opinions, but opinions which can be correlated with something out there. So they are not fantasy, but they don't claim to be the word of some divine arbiter either. So that to me is the magic of recontextualization or subjectivity. If that makes sense at all. I'm sorry if I've babbled.
No, that's very illuminating. That's really helpful. In the same way, in your essay, you speak about composition and meaning making as two aspects of your photography. So when it comes to meaning making, my question was, how do you do that? And then how much scope do you give the reader for interpretation, or what is the ratio that you leave for the reader?
Right. So okay. Okay. So composition basically, when it relates to photography, I don't know about other visual arts. I don't have any training in them. When it regards photography, composition is the way that you include something in a frame or exclude something from a frame, and how much you proportion you assign, how much negative and positive space you assign the various elements that make up your photograph. I know I'm over intellectualizing it. It happens in a split second, right? It's a judgment. It's an event. It is not a analysis, because a photo can be made or can be unmade in a fraction of a second. So that is composition in photography. When we talk of meaning making, so I must also confess that I come from a background of training in photojournalism, which is basically a fancy name for telling a story through photos. Look, something cool happened, or look, something tragic happened, or look, something bizarre happened, or look, something touching happened, and this is your photo. That gives you the whole picture along with a title and a caption, right? So that I come from that background. So it is in that context that I'm talking about meaning making. I'm essentially saying that I approach meaning making as investing photos with stories, or with the fraction of a story, with a scene or a story. The best photos in the world, not saying they're mine, but if you look at the work of practically any good photojournalist or somebody who has come through the path of photojournalism, you will see that they're excellent storytellers. And that is why their photos are timeless. Not because of the technical wizardry in that photo. If you see the photos which focus only on technical proficiency, they tend to be forgotten after a period of time. But it is the photos which tell you which pack as much of a story as possible in one frame. Those are the ones that survive. So that is what I mean by meaning making. How much your photo can tell a story. Now, again, that story doesn't have to be momentous. Not every story has to be, okay, the pillaging of Troy. It can be very little stuff. One of my favorite photos is, I think, by okay, I forget the name, but he is my colleague. He's a photojournalistic colleague. It is a laborer's. It is a child sleeping in a sling or a hammock made from a sari, and the light is falling in such a way that the sari is slightly translucent, and the baby's outline can be seen, so it looks like a womb. And that is his image. It's a wonderful image. It's a magnificent image. I think, unless I'm very much mistaken, that image won an award, and rightly so, because it is telling you so much, right? It's telling you about class. It is telling you about poverty. It is telling you about motherhood and, mother-child bond. And it is telling you about the human condition. So it is lots of layers. So that is meaning making in a very, very solid and dense, in a good way, manner. So that is what I mean by meaning making, the storytelling potential of a photograph. It's also true, like you said, that a photo can mean many things to many people. But, and I don't know, I haven't thought this through, but I think that it is really the photographer's job to at least present a bouquet of possibilities out of which the viewer can choose which one to relate to. So if that baby in a sari sling photo, what it does is it also frames the bouquet of concepts inherent in the photo. Nobody is going to say, हाँ यहाँ पे आग लगी थी तो firefighters hose लेके आग बुझा रहे हैं. No, because that context cannot be related to that photo. It is impossible. So the photographer is limiting the number of concepts available to the reader, to the viewer.
Wonderful. For the next doubt that I had, I will need to read an abstract from your essay, which says, photography and poetry are distinct arts, but there is a lot of overlap between them. At least there is in the way I see them. To my mind, a good stanza and a good photograph are both strange and silent. They defamiliarize, which accounts for their strangeness, and they communicate as much through the associations and implications they threw up as through their overt content, or they should. So, can you tell us your journey of this photography and poetry, and how do you build that bridge?
That kind of sets me down memory lane. So I took up poetry before I took up photography, seriously. So I was, so you can say that I understood image making through poetry. So I used to read a lot of poems, right? And often I used to read them on the job, because there are frequently times in a journalist's day when nothing is happening, or you don't want to do anything, which is more common. because nothing interesting is happening in the city. It's a dull day. It's a summer day. May vacation hai. Kahin kuch nahi ho raha hai. So for some reason, I just picked up, I started browsing poetry on my work computer. And then I got hooked, right? To works of modern Indian poets, especially Bombay poets, like Arundhati Subramaniam, Arun Kolatkar, Dilip Chitre, all those people, right? And then I read this Ezra Pound essay. I don't know how I reached it, but eventually you do some theorizing about poetry, where he talks about how poetry works. It works in three ways, right? It casts an image on your mind, it creates sounds in your ear, and it also makes ideas in your head, which you can associate with. He had fancy Greek names for them, never mind, but this is how he says it works. And I was very hooked onto the visual aspect of it for some reason, right? So then I began to analyze how poets made images in their poems. And that knowledge was extremely handy because I could almost directly apply it to poetry. It sounds very weird, right? It sounds very counterintuitive that an artificially constructed image made of words or whatever, but definitely on the page in the form of text, can inform a completely different art. But it did. The poet's economy with images, the poet's proficiency with image making, the control, these were all very useful when it came to applying my head to the viewfinder. And also, I do believe that there is something called a poetic sensibility, which it is useful for a photographer to have, right? Otherwise, you become a slave to your machine, because the machine is mediating between you and the world. But if you have a poetic sensibility, you can actually work with the machine to produce something that is human, that is yours, that is not completely pixels on a drive or dots per inch on a photo paper, but something that is a human document. So yes, so poetry brought me to the image, and the image making helped me to compose my photos. But again, I also want to emphasize that this is the only commonality that I can find. Okay, I'm not saying that every poet is going to be a great photographer. Every photographer is going to be a great poet. But if you look, but a surprisingly large number of photographers that I have spoken to are also closeted poets. A lot of poets that I know are quite good hands at a camera. So I think that there is some weird alchemic thing there. Don't know what it is, but it's there. More so than other textual arts, probably. Poetry, photography, definitely, sister disciplines.
Oh, wonderful. And then haiku particularly fits in because that is defined as an image in 3 lines. But were you writing free verse and then came to haiku, or did you begin with writing haiku? Or
So I began with writing haiku because I was very, very drawn to, and also I found myself writing very aphoristically, right? I love the idea of using few words, partly because of laziness, but also because, there was something very appealing about having fewer words say a lot or hint a lot or whatever. And also I began writing on a cell phone, okay, a dumb phone, like a Nokia, one of those 3300 series. And I started writing on those. So screen was like, I think 2 inches or 1.5 inches in diameter. You can't write a novel on those, right? You have to write short. So that also contributed to, keeping it short. And then of course, haiku, I don't know how I came across them, but once I came across them, I never let go. And then, I discovered the Japanese masters and the Chinese masters. And then I saw that there was an Indian haiku movement also. And then I started writing haiku, and I wrote a lot. I wrote a lot of haiku and published a few, some of them in quite good journals also. So yes, so haiku happened first, free verse happened next, and photography happened last. But now photography and free verse are going parallelly.
Wonderful. So I would like to share some of your work with the audience here.
Thank you.
If you allow it, I'll just screen share. Is this visible?
Yes. Now it is. Yes.
So, would you like to read?
Right. So yes. So I'll explain the photo later. Not necessary, but I'll give you the context, the history, the background to it. The haiku is: crossroads, I wait for the cool wind to go first. Now, again, there is this saying in Hindi, charane ki murgi aur barane ka masala, which means that, so I don't want to explain the haiku, but there is a Buddhist concept in it, where the poet doesn't want to disturb the natural order. Like a good traveler, he only wants to leave his footprints behind and nothing more. So in this case, not wanting to disturb the wind resulted in this haiku. And this is a photo taken in the national park, Borivali National Park. So this is the Bombay skyline. I don't know which part of Bombay it is. It is taken from a plateau overlooking, I think, the old caves. And this kid just wandered onto this path, path of, I think, igneous rock, and the frame just made itself, And it was taken on a cell phone, by the way. I should also add this, that of the 40 photographs in this book, I think 3 were taken with a professional camera. The rest were taken with a mediocre cell phone. So crossroads, I wait for the cool wind to go first. Children's sandals headed nowhere, my bloodline. This is मेरी building का photo है, and these are my neighbors' children's slippers. So again, the photo just made itself. It's just cell phone photo hai. And these are wooden stairs. So the building is very old. These are teak stairs. And again, the haiku is self-explanatory, that childlessness is the one of the themes in it.
I don't know. But
So
the
that's not
texture
facing
of
the. Sorry.
No, Sumit, go ahead. You were saying.
They're not facing the same direction, also, right? So,
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Right. Absolutely. So children's sandals headed nowhere, my bloodline.
I was saying the texture of those teak staircases is adding so much to this photograph. I mean,
yeah,
there's a lot of.
Yeah, and that is some of it is I don't know if some growth, some plant-like growth, fungal or algal. I don't know what it is. Some of it is just paint or materials used in waterproofing the terrace. And while the workers were taking it up, they evidently spilled some. So it brought out the character of the wood which which is just which is teak, which is Burma teak, by the way. I think it's Burma teak, but it's definitely teak. So after 1948, the building I think was built in around before 1950. So the stairs have not needed any upkeep whatsoever, and that that's the result of it.
Should we read one more before I ask you a question? Because some of these photographs are very beautiful. So.
Thank you. Nap time, again the same family, okay. And this is they often put their teddy bear on the tricycle, and then they go home for the afternoon nap. So I just literally walk out, and this scene presents itself, and I said, what cloud cover hai, benefit kar sakte hain. And I pull out my cell phone. Okay, that was a bad joke. And I take this photo. Nap time, the plush bear waits for his friends.
So what I wanted to ask you is, you say that photographs are a way of storytelling, but how do you find the story there in this mundane everydayness of life? How do you see potential? Or do you go with a particular mindset? So the image happens first, or the mindset happens first, and that is
that's okay. Wow. Okay. So in my case, I don't go with a mindset. Yeah. But if I feel some visual element kind of tugging at me, where I just feel this sudden anxiety if I don't look at it, right? Then that's a very good kind of a magnetic attraction to that. So I have to take a photo of that. But the other approach might also work, where you go with a certain constraint set up on yourself. कि मैं खाली I will only take photos with pigeons in them. I mean, to just to give a very silly example, but it can actually work. Or I will only take photos in which the color red appears. Or I will only take photos of women on the street, or children on the street, or people playing on the street. So you impose constraints on yourself, and that gives you photographs. Often in my case, the constraint is the choice of lens. कि आज टेली लेंस के साथ ही फोटो निकालना है, or only a wide angle lens today. So both approaches can work. You can either go there completely open to what attracts you, or you can go there with preconceptions saying, I will only look at this or that. And both approaches are very successful in my experience. But more often, if you're being very practical, you'll do both simultaneously. Because too much freedom in photography will paralyze you. As in poetry also, right? If you had to write, you will go blank. You will go into a blissful or whatever kind of silence, right? Spiritual silence. But to produce poetry, you have to put some constraints on yourself. It is the same with photography.
right. So I think Shankar had a question.
Yeah, Sumit, have you ever had a haiku or a poem in your mind and then gone out looking for a photograph to fit that specifically?
No, actually, I've never had that. I would imagine that would be very difficult. I mean, but now that you mention it, I'm very tempted to try something like that, because it is a beautiful constraint, right? That the haiku is your lens through which you will be using your camera. So thank you, Shankar. I might just, if and when the lockdown clears, I might actually try that. कि पहले haiku लिखना है, फिर then you try to match a photo with it. Sounds great, but it'll be very difficult, but it'll be very interesting.
The reason I thought of that is because when I read haikus, I always get some visual image in my head. So then I don't write haikus, but then it follows logically that when you write a haiku, you do have some kind of image. It doesn't have to be one particular image, but you have a sense of an image, right? So if you go out looking for that, like if you write a haiku and it's about the rain, then you can definitely get an image of a photo of so that's what I was thinking. Maybe it can be a picture follows the words.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And there can be many kinds of correlations also. So
But,
they can be,
Correct.
sorry.
So I was asking, is not this constraint of a haiku as Shankar specified, but or do you specifically go out and say कि मुझे ये shoot करना ही है आज, or you just chance upon something and see, because you have the photographer's eye, right? And you chance upon something and see कि ये मेरे frame में बैठ रहा है, or do you have a specific agenda in mind sometimes, like when you go on a photo walk or something, but I have to capture this today, something like this.
So I do mainly street photography and a little bit of street portraiture, which is non-posed. So I have to be careful about not restricting myself too much, because the street is a very dynamic beast, right? Nothing is in your control, right? So you have to set the right amount of constraints which will liberate you. Too little and you will get lost in the street, and too many and you will not take any photos at all. So for me, it's like, let me give an example. So I don't know how I came across this, but maybe I was on Google Maps or something, and I saw that there is a street in Bombay called Mirza Ghalib Street. Okay, it runs through, it runs from Baikala onwards onto, I think, south from Baikala. And I was immediately, I was like, chalo, we have to go. I have to go for a photo walk on that street, completely blind, right? It was a fishing expedition. But again, the constraints were, I will not go outside this street. And it's a vast street, right? You can walk for hours along that street. So it's a long street. It's actually an arterial road. Hence the important name given to it, right? So that was one constraint. The second constraint was only one lens. So I didn't have to worry about zoom karna padega ke nahi, because you zoom by using your legs. And the third constraint was street photography. I will be on the street. I will not go into people's houses. Okay? I'm allergic to pain. So and fourth, you will no permission, no need to take permission. I know people will not agree to this, but if you're on the street, you're in the public gaze, and I will not misuse your photo. So I will not take your permission to take your photo. That is the contract. It's a social contract. And Indian law will bear me out. Okay, Photographic Act very clearly says, if you're in a public place, you can take photos. So these are 4 constraints that are automatically applicable to me, even when I step out of the house. So I don't have to work to my constraints. They automatically come on, then I just tweak them a little. So yes, so I go out with an intent to do street photography, which is a major constraint. And it frees me up.
And the prime lens, it must be a task, right? You have to get up close with the subject. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I have 2 prime lenses. I use a Fujifilm, which is a Fujifilm camera, very compact, one-hander. You can wear it around your neck, no problem for your neck, no cervical spondylosis, because it's very light. And I have only 2 lenses. One is a wide angle lens, which will capture a large swathe of the scene, and the other is a tele lens, which will focus on a particular part of the scene. And I don't carry both of them. So I take I pre-decide, कि मेरे को एक पे एक ही करना है, which means that you are open to losing photos also, because some photos you cannot capture. Then you work with it. I'll tell you one more thing. Sometimes you pre-focus your lens also. I generally pre-focus my lens. So you pre-focus your camera, at least my camera has this feature where it tells me ki between, I can just tweak it. I can move, when I move the lens, I see a scale.
Yeah.
So I adjust my lens so that anything between, I think, 7 feet and 20 feet is in focus. So that is the width of a street. So I literally don't have to autofocus. No, when I see something, instantaneous capture. So that is one more liberation, because autofocus is slow. It makes you miss shots. So it's paradoxical, but turning off autofocus will make you faster if you know how to pre-focus. And that is the secret of street photography. Pre-focusing is the secret of street photography. All the greats did it. So constraints, I don't want to get into technicalities of it, but constraints are liberating.
Do you find the same in your writing too?
Yes.
More constraints, the more liberation you feel.
Not so, but a judicious mix of constraints is very liberating and very thought-provoking. So word length is a constraint, tone is a constraint, genre is a constraint, all very helpful. The choice to breach a genre is a constraint.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
The form too, right? What you're going to write today. That
Very major, very major. And it's okay to renegotiate the constraints as you go along. There aren't any rules, right? So as in photography, as in haiku, as in free verse, same constraints used judiciously and they will take you a long way. At least that is my limited experience.
From your previous bit of the conversation, it almost felt like the machine is an extension of your mind. Like your mind knows what's it going to do today, and then you dictate the machine, or the machine dictates. So can you?
Yes, both can be true. In my case, because I'm, I practice a lot with the camera, and because I'm trained as a photographer, so then I know how my camera will behave in certain light situations, right? So there is this whole great skill called reading the light. Like you read a poem, you can read light also. So the direction of the light, the intensity of the light, the color of the light, the quality of the light, whether it is harsh or soft, whether it is direct or diffused. So all these things, you can read them effortlessly after with practice. Just like you can read a poem and then get its flavor effortlessly after a certain period. It's the same with light, and you can read light. So the camera becomes an extension of you, and you begin to get very attached to it, which is why people get very fanatical about what cameras they use, and they will troll you, and sometimes you will also feel like trolling people. Ki sala tu kya Canon use karta hai? Who the fuck do you think you are? I don't do that, but I can understand people who want to do, who want to abuse each other's mothers because of the choice of cameras that they use. I have compassion for them. I will not do that, but so it becomes an extension. But on the other hand, happy accidents are also there. So I will tell you this incident which my photography teacher told me. There is this very well-known photographer, Bengali name, I forget which. So what happened was he had uska camera on tha, and he had put it on the floor for some reason. Maybe he was cleaning his camera closet or his bag or something, and his dog came there and he stepped on the camera shutter button and took a photo. So happy accidents can happen. We all know the story which went viral of that, that monkey or ape, yeah, which took a selfie with a professional camera, and the photo was brilliant. It was a brilliant photo, right? But then the question arose ki copyright kiska hai? I mean, it's a valid question. I don't want to get into it. You can write books on the subject. But so happy accidents, my point is that happy accidents also happen. They're very rare, but they can happen. But for the most part, yes, the camera is an extension of your body. And it definitely makes you, it adds to you. It makes you, it becomes a part of the whole that you call yourself. Like any art, really.
So Suhit, before I move on to, I was hoping to read some more poems, but is there particular poems that you would like us to read, or
From the book or just in general?
anything you want?
Interesting.
I have a few picks from the book. So because I was fortunate to have the book. If you want the book, go to Amazon and read all the poems.
So okay. Wait, this is a good one. Now I will plug the book. See, it is available on Amazon. But if you go to the publisher's website, you will get a discount. They have overpriced it on Amazon, and they have given a discount on their website. What strategy this is, I don't know, but this is the reality. So you go to the publisher's website, which is havakal.com. Havakal is the publisher, a very dynamic, independent publisher based in Kolkata and Delhi. So Havakal has published the book. So you get it from their website if you like.
The link is in the chat.
Areva Sumit, you saved my, thank you.
He's fast fingers, Sumit.
Very fast. So where was I? Yeah. So there is this wonderful imagistic poem, which I read recently. And I don't know, again, what you people think of Billy Collins. I know many poets don't like Billy Collins, but I love his work. So there is this poem called Shoveling Snow with the Buddha. Would you like to share it? We can.
Sumit, can you share the link or screen share?
Just a second. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Poem Hunter, yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So there will be a very irritating video which will play. You need to turn it off, preempt its arrival. So I'll read this out because I love reading Billy Collins. Yeah, it's like, that's my thing. So Shoveling Snow with the Buddha, Billy Collins. In the usual iconography of the temple or the local walk, you would never see him doing such a thing. Tossing the dry snow over a mountain of his bare round shoulder, his hair tied in a knot, a model of concentration. Sitting is more his speed, if that is the word, for what he does or does not do. Even the season is wrong for him. In all his manifestations, is it not warm or slightly humid? Is this not implied by his serene expression, that smile so wide it wraps itself around the waist of the universe? But here we are, working our way down the driveway, one shovelful at a time. We toss the light powder into the clear air. We feel the cold mist on our faces. And with every heave, we disappear and become lost to each other in these sudden clouds of our own making, these fountain bursts of snow. This is so much better than a sermon in church, I say out loud, but Buddha keeps on shoveling. This is the true religion, the religion of snow and sunlight and winter geese barking in the sky, I say, but he is too busy to hear me. He has thrown himself into shoveling snow as if it were the purpose of existence, as if the sign of a perfect life were a clear driveway. You could back the car down easily and drive off into the vanities of the world with a broken heater fan and a song on the radio. All morning long, we work side by side, me with my commentary, and he inside his generous pocket of silence, until the hour is nearly noon and the snow is piled high all around us. Then I hear him speak. After this, he asks, can we go inside and play cards? Certainly, I reply, and I will heat some milk and bring cups of hot chocolate to the table while you shuffle the deck and our boots stand dripping by the door. Ah, says the Buddha, lifting his eyes and leaning for a moment on his shovel before he drives the thin blade again deep into the glittering white snow. So I chose this poem because it's imagistic. And the images are full of feeling and they engage all your senses. They engage your eye, they engage your eye with the whiteness of the scene. They engage your ear with the barking of the geese and the hiss of the shovel as it cuts through the snow or whatever. And they engage your sense of hearing with the broken radio and the, So I would like to suggest that in many poems and in many photos, the aesthetic experiences that you get are the same. That the way you relate to many poems is the way you relate to many photos. And that is one more, again, common fountain from which both these aesthetic experiences come. That's my practitioner's guesstimate. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a theorist. I'm just telling you what I feel about certain poems and how it's similar to the way I feel about certain photos.
There's one more, few more poems that I would like to share with the audience from Sumit's book. This one I particularly liked because of it does so much while doing so little. And so you want to read, Sudhit?
Yeah.
So can you zoom out a bit?
Zoom out.
Zoom out. We can't see the third line.
The black bar is.
Yeah. Just a second. I'll do it. This thing is acting. Yeah. Better.
So this is seeking a new poem. I look down. Someone else's footsteps. This is again a mobile phone photo taken in a public park in North Bombay. Self-explanatory photo. And seeking a new poem, I look down, someone else's footsteps.
It was also so meta. I mean, for you in that moment. So
yeah, absolutely. So I should also point out that I took the photos first and then wrote the haiku for the photos. If that helps you to kind of.
So you would have a series of these photos, perhaps, that you took of the same thing or of a tree or something, and then you choose out of those one of them for the haiku. Is that how it works? Or
okay. Sometimes that is how it works. Sometimes, because sometimes if it is a static scene, then you have the luxury of taking multiple photos from different angles and with different compositions. But sometimes if it's a dynamic scene, if there's too much movement, then you get just one shot. And sometimes it comes off, sometimes it works. With practice, you get more hits than misses. So I hope that answered the.
Thanks.
This one also I liked a lot. Evening, the sun's light forms a haiku. Evening, the sun's light forms a haiku. So So the question, do you want to say something about this photograph?
The photograph is there in 3 lines, right? Also, there are 3 lines. So that I looked at it and immediately thought, "Ye to haiku hai," and then I just took that photo. And it is that grill is a toilet grill. I'm sorry for de-romanticizing that photo for you, but toilet ka grill hai wo. Like, what to do? It's there. The photo is there. You take it.
No, we are looking behind the magic curtain. So, it helps.
Yeah.
That stories can be anywhere and you have to go looking for them. But basically, that is what I wanted to ask you, that are the haikus adding context or adding to the story? Because merely by taking a photograph, you are anyways directing our gaze in a particular direction. And then how do haikus work? Are they telling that story? Are they telling us the context, the backstory? So,
Right. So I think that in some cases the haiku recontextualize the photo. In this book, in some cases they recontextualize the photo. In some they add to the context of the photo. So it there's a different combination for every photo haiku pair. But they create a hybrid context, right? Which is neither fully image nor fully text. So you look at the photo or the haiku depending on how the publisher or the designer has placed them. And then you look at the other element and then you recombine them in your head. So it creates a hybrid context. I think that was very, that to me was very interesting to do.
yeah, the book is very clever in that sense. It exactly tells you where to look as you turn the pages. Like sometimes the photographs come first, sometimes the haiku comes first, sometimes the haiku is placed on the left side. So I thought in that sense, the book was very beautiful and clever in guiding the reader. So,
Thank you. But again, I must give due credit where it is due. The design, I had very little to input for the design. The publisher did a lot of the heavy lifting when it came to the design. And I had envisaged a completely different design. I wanted each pair to be a centerfold, in the sense that there will be the photo for a separate page for the photo and a separate page for a single haiku, with a vast expanse of white space, around it. But I think that the approach they suggested, I agreed with that better. It's a busier page, it's a more efficient thing, also brings down the cost of the book. So all those things so I took the publisher's suggestion and they ran with it.
right. My last question, Sudhir, before we open to the audience is, can you tell us a little about your editing process for the book and for yourself, especially in forms like haiku, where there's very limited scope. And the photographs are already there. So, but then did you do some editing? Did you shuffle the arrangement of the poems or something about that process?
Okay. So for this book, I arranged the photographs first. I did a first cut of 120 photographs. Then I whittled them down to 100. And with great dil pe patthar rakhe, I brought them down to 40. So then I arranged them in a sequence, which was made easier by the fact that they were all black and white, which makes it very, very easy, because then the color palette goes out of the picture. Sometimes you can't put 2 photos next to each other because their colors are clashing in a way that you don't want. But black and white tha to kuch, that was not a problem. So then I arranged them according to the rhythms of the city. So the first photo is of the early morning and the last photo is late night. And then the day progresses through those disparate photos. And so the haiku pretty much arranged themselves, because the photo arrangement was already made rigid before I started writing the haiku. But haiku I had to redraft a lot because I was coming back to haiku after a long hiatus. After years, I was writing haiku. So I had to kind of regain those muscles again. So a lot of drafting, redrafting had to take place. Lot of it.
What was the main thing? Was it the sound? Was it the syntax? Was it the image? What was your priority while editing them?
So I wanted to actually, every haiku had to speak about the photo, right? It had to be linked with the photo in some way. But I did not want to make that link too obvious. So the haiku can't lean on the photo as a crutch. It has to be its own thing, but again, it has to be a third thing when you put it next to the photo. I don't know if I managed that or not, but that was the attempt. The haiku has to freestand and the photo has to freestand, and together they have to mean a third thing where they don't overpower each other. Again, I had no parameters for this, because how can you tell if a picture is overpowering a piece of text or a piece of text is overpowering a picture, right? I don't know how to answer that question, right? So I'm just going by feel, by I don't know what to call it, intuition or whatever you call it. So these considerations were there, I guess. Yeah.
But if it is reassuring, most of the haikus stand alone. Like, even if you don't look at the picture, you get, like Shankar said, after reading a haiku, you get an image. So yeah, wonderful. Congratulations again. And yeah, so now we are open to any Q&A. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Let's look at them first. So Swati is asking, how do you choose which photograph write a haiku on?
Okay, most difficult, most difficult question. How did I choose which photo to write a haiku on? Okay. Again, the idea of constraints comes into play. First, it had to be a monochrome book, right? Black and white karna tha. So some photos, when you converted them to black and white, they disqualified themselves, for purely aesthetic reasons. Some photos don't look good in black and white. They're flat. They become flat, or they become dull or whatever. So some you rejected because of that. Then some were rejected because I simply couldn't fit them into the framework of the sequence of photos. So then those were culled out. Then some, for the life of me, I could not think of haiku to go with them. Frank confession, right? So then those are out. Finally, you have 40 which are cohesive, which are sequential, which are looking good in black and white, and which you can write haiku for. And then those are the book. So a series of constraints again had to be negotiated before I could arrive at this sequence. So it was that decision. Also technical choices. Some photos, well, not so much nowadays, because most phone photos also have got good megapixel count. So if you want to print like a postcard sized photo, even it's adequate. So that constraint doesn't exist anymore, unless you are printing a legacy photo, taken on some old Nokia camera phone, from the first generation of camera phones. But we don't have that problem anymore. So the constraints now are purely non-technical for the most part.
Sumit, you had a question, you want to ask it? Should I read it out?
Sure.
This is Haiga. Haiga is painting around haiku. I don't know what exactly it is, but I know it's an art form that is in the family of haiku.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask: is there something modern equivalent for a photo or a photographic art form, something like that? Is there something in that pantheon of
Yes. Yes, there is. There have been various experiments with photo books in which text has been incorporated in or around the photograph. I can, it eludes my memory for now, but I can message the names to Kinjal and she can share them with you. So yes, there have been experiments where not in the spirit of the Japanese Haiga, which is again a hybrid art, but here in a very contemporary, fresh sense, pairing text and photographs, kind of interpenetrating the contexts of text and photographs in the same photo book. Those experiments have been made, and it is in fact a fresh field. It's a new field. I feel there's not much work done in that yet.
Yeah, Girija, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, finish what you're asking.
Yeah, I was done.
You're done. Okay. Yeah. Right. So, Hit, I have a question based on this poem that I have read. It's called The War Photographer by Carol and. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Right. So this poem that I've read, it's called The War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. She was a Scottish poet. I'm not sure if you've read this poem, but it obviously, as the name suggests, it talks about war photography, and in that it's one of the things under photojournalism. From what I understood, there is a moral ambiguity attached when you're capturing grief. And it can be so heavy on you just as an individual, and you have to take you have to capture the moment and not do anything about that situation there, and that is just so heartbreaking. Have you faced anything like that or something similar?
No.
I mean, okay.
Fortunately, I have never been a professional photojournalist. I have been a professional journalist. I am a professional journalist, but I cover arts and culture, right? So I don't cover disasters or catastrophes or conflicts. And I would not be comfortable or indeed sane for a very long time if I tried to do that.
Right.
There is a different breed of, I've met a few of the guys who specialize in covering disasters and conflicts, and they're a different breed. There's something different about them. There is a little bit of the adventurer in them. There is a little bit of the explorer. There is also a little bit of the I don't know, they're attracted to high risk situations, and they don't they seem to be able to process the grimness and horrors that they see.
Correct.
To some extent, at least, better than the rest of us, which is a prerequisite for them remaining sane and healthy and indeed alive. But I don't think I could do that. Not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
But yes, I have covered disasters as a journalist starting out, right? So I have covered fires, I have covered building collapses, because every young reporter is started out on those kind of assignments, right? Because they are trial by fire, but they're also, they allow the editor to assess you. Bomb blasts, I've covered. And then that is, I knew very early on that is not my kind of work. So no, I haven't. No worries.
Unless anybody else wants to go, I had a question. How do you balance the practice of these two art forms, poetry and photography? Like, do you practice every day, and how do you balance?
Actually, I write. I try to write every day, but that is both journalism and poetry, right? So journalism, that is part of my that is my job. So that leave that aside. That you have to do. Poetry, I try to write maybe thrice a week or at least more. At least not a little bit. Even a few lines is okay, as long as it advances the poem or whatever. Does something new or something, right? Photography, maybe once a week. Before the lockdown, it was once a week. I try not to overdo photography or indeed poetry or journalism. So I try. I know there's a school of thought which says no, you should exhaust yourself. Give of yourself until you can give no more, etc., etc. I don't believe that. I believe that if you don't have fuel in the tank, you will not be able to repeat what you are doing the next day. That's my thing. I'm not saying it's not a rule, right? It's just my way of operating. So I try to do stuff in moderation, partly because I'm doing three things, right? These are three demanding, passionate, three demanding passions. Journalism, again, a full discipline in itself, a full art form maybe in itself. Poetry, definitely a full art form. Photography, definitely a full art form. So how do you prevent burnout? You balance them. But I mean, for most of us who live in a money economy, you have to first, kind of get the finances in order. So obviously your first preference is you do your job first, right? Mahine ka kharcha. And then you, in the time that remains, you judiciously do the other stuff. That's what I do. I mean, and I'm not sad about it. It's good. It's good in a way. If I had all the time for photography and poetry, I would get very bored and basically become very listless and what do you call it? Kind of lost at sea, you can say. Right? So it's good. Being in the world is a good thing.
Wow, that would be super relatable for so many of us here. But taking off from Sumit, do you have like a different mindset? Like when you're on the street with a camera, your mind operates differently, and while writing poetry, is it different? Or if it's...
That's a good question. Let me try to think it through as I'm answering you. To some extent, it is different. Right? Because as a photographer, you are thinking along at least two layers. One is the visual layer, where you are observing the world around you. And the second is the technical layer, where you are manipulating the machine in your hand. As a poet, that's not what I'm doing, right? I'm not working in those contexts at all. But the commonality is that in both cases, though not in the same way, you are open to possibilities. So you are kind of being open to what combinations of ideas or what feelings or whatever strikes you, and how you work with those is your craft. So I would say that there is also, it is a leap of faith, right? When you write a poem, you don't know whether it's going to, ideally, you don't know whether it's going to work, right? You don't impose your safety net on a poem. At least that is the way that I see it, or shouldn't. In the same way, when you when you go out on a photo walk, you don't say, I'll take this photo of a lamppost because I need to put something on my Instagram. Right? It's a leap of faith again. There have been photo walks when I don't get a photo that I want to keep, or when I don't even touch my camera for whatever reason. And then there are photo walks where you just step out of the house and click, and it's a keeper, right? It's a banger, as they say in the photography hobby. It's a banger. It's a banger photograph. Acha photograph. It's something you will want to keep or share. So it also so leaps of faith are important, in my opinion. And something that I am trying to inculcate in myself is that to take more of them, to take them in ways that previously that doesn't worry about the output. In journalism, okay, you have to think about output, because there is a industry standard, right? And there is an editor whom you have to, whose bar you have to, who sets a bar for you, and then there is a reader who expects something from you. So that is different, right? But in terms of poetry and photography, I'm trying to kind of take more leaps of faith where I don't expect output. I just want to be done when the job is done, not when I say ki, yaar, abhi to kuch I need a photo. I need some output, some productivity from this photo walk. Or yaar, ek saal se kuch poem publish nahi kiya hai. I need to produce something. I'm trying to avoid that mindset. I'm not saying it's what you should do, obviously, but I'm trying to avoid it. And ironically, when you start thinking, when you start thinking like that, when you liberate yourself from the need to produce output, paradoxically, you become more productive. I don't know how. Maybe that's not even true, but it's something to be investigated. I suspect it might be true.
Kinjal will take a picture now.
Yes. So we have a tradition of taking pictures for all our sessions.
Everyone turn on your cameras.
Arun, Vasudha.
How should we frame this, Suvit?
Sorry?
How should we frame this? The picture.
You can't. Zoom has already constrained you to take it the way it is presented in gallery view.
Check. Just a sec. Yeah. So that I had one more question. Like, I used to do photography a few years back, and in that the basic thing, I used to do more compositing thing, matlab, taking like 10 different pictures and make a different picture. And in that, all the tutors I referred to said that if a picture doesn't work in black and white, it doesn't work at all. that's thing that, do you do some, it's like whittling down a picture to its basic elements, right? So do you do something like that in your poetry too, like whittle down something to its basic elements and then expand from?
Okay, to begin with, I don't believe that at all. Where the black and white thing, right? I don't think that's a thing. Okay, I don't know who said that, but I've heard it before. Cartier-Bresson, the father of modern photojournalism, I have heard that or read somewhere that he used to dismiss color photography. This is not true. This is whatever, which is ridiculous. Absolutely absurd. Some photos work better in color than they do in black and white. And for some photos work better in black and white than they do in color. There's no rule. And if you're working in photojournalism, you better be good at color photography. Better be. And if you're even a social media photographer, a lot of the photos that are gaining traction on social media are color photos, right? And it's a world of color. We are not dogs.
But you get a sense of light, at least from black and white because it's just basics, right? You need to get the
I
light.
think no,
Yeah.
I see that, no, but if they're saying it's, if they say something like
Like a blanket statement or something.
हाँ हाँ
It's
हाँ
not true. It's not correct.
no, if they say कि हाँ तुमको अगर सीखना है तो black and white निकालो, then you will read the zones properly, then I can buy that, right? But if they say black and white में चलेगा तो color में चलेगा, it's wrong. It's just plain wrong. So no, now the second part of the question, I have never thought of it that way, where you whittle parts of your poetry out. But of late, I do feel that I don't know really. I mean, I don't think you can really correlate 1:1 correlations between photographic and poetic metaphors are possible. I don't think that's possible. But yes, there is something to be said for simplifying. If you can say something simply and do justice to it, then you don't have to use excessively architectured language. And it's the same of photos, right? If you can simplify the elements in a photograph without robbing the photo of its force, then I would suggest doing that. So in fact, there used to be this very controversial statement which some photographers used to, photojournalists that I know used to disparage. They said, "Arey हाँ ये जो agency वाले photographers है ना, like Reuters, AP, AFP, whatever." They said, "हाँ ये agency वाले photographers को सब tight और bright चाहिए." Tight मतलब tightly cropped photos, get as close as possible, and bright मतलब no gray shades, everything has to pop. So that is their aesthetic, which was disparaged by a lot of photographers. In the same way, I think that there's no one rule for it, but if you can say it simply, say it simply. That's what I do. I think it was Mark Twain who said that. I don't know who said it actually, but I read it in a authenticated book that don't use a $10 word when a 10-cent one will do.
Thank you, sir.
Does anyone have any more questions, or I'll just be selfish and read 2 more poems. So
Sure.
I'll just give a small opportunity to anybody who has any more questions. Okay, so I'm going to screen share, and because Suhit said that it's the progression of a day, as we began with the morning, I would like to read the last 2 poems. Seems like apt poetic into the session. Can everyone see the screen? So if you want to read.
Yeah. A bloodthirsty deity bedecked with the skyline. And the photo is a view of South Bombay taken from Carter Road Garden, Carter Road Joggers Park. And those 2 triangles of light that you see at your right side there, yes, that is the ceiling. Those are the arches of the ceiling. So that is the Bandra Worli ceiling arches. And this is the photo is pretty close to what I actually saw. It was very dark, it was looking like that. And that black at the bottom of the frame is the sea. It's the sea. You can't see it, but that's the water body.
This photograph reminded me of Mumbai Devi, because this is actually Mumbai as an island. Because there's just
absolutely, and you are seeing one of the original islands of Bombay, after the reclamation, because Bandra, beyond the creek. So you're looking beyond the creek. So a bloodthirsty deity bedecked with the skyline. Bloodthirsty deity is Mumbai.
I could easily imagine this one blown up to a big 10 by 10 frame or something. So good.
I would love to see the effect that would have, because it would, first of all, it would darken a wall completely.
Yeah.
Right? It would absorb the light. It's black color, no? So it would completely dominate a room, perhaps quite oppressively. So
it would be very effective. So it has to be a large room.
Exactly. So you probably wouldn't want to blow it up that big, but I can see this being effective at the 2 or 3 feet kind of magnification, because then it will not oppress the room. It's a dark image, no? So generally light images you can blow up to any size in a room because they reflect light and you want a room to be lit up. Black images, they will absorb the light. So
was the ratio this only 1:1?
No. It was actually landscape format.
That's all.
The designer chose this, and I went with it. It was.
Looks good.
It actually separates the layers of the image better than the landscape format. Then the sky becomes a layer, the city becomes a layer, and the black at the bottom becomes a third layer. So it becomes a progression. Then I said, okay, we'll go with it.
Yeah, love the sky in this.
Yeah, it was a wonderful day.
The last one, I think, is perhaps the only one where the whole page is as Suhit would want it initially.
Yeah. I don't know why they chose this particular thing, but okay, this probably went for effect. So it's hard to see in print, but in the PDF you can still see it. This is a reflection from a window taken at night. So you can see some squares of light poking through the window on the wall. But again, on the print, it vanishes. It becomes black on the printed page. So that, okay, 101, yet no dream, 010. Okay. I won't analyze this for you. I'll leave you to do the heavy lifting for it.
This is the collection just closes on such a beautiful note. It's wonderfully done.
Thank you.
So if I may ask you, what next? What are you working on next? Is it more photographs, more haiku?
Right now I'm apart from journalism and whatever, I'm actually working on a full-length poetry collection, and it looks like a project, a long project. So I am hoping that it will be, it will reach some sort of a shape by the end of this year. But I'd rather get it right than get it quick.
Will there be pictures in it?
Will there be pictures? Oh yeah. No, man. I think I will resist the temptation, because I'd like the poems to breathe on their own.
I thought you would do something like Sony has snuck in his photographs too, right?
In first contact.
That is right. No, but in his case, it is also. I haven't read the full book. I've read some parts of it. To my understanding, it is a kind of a personal reflection kind of a theme, right?
Yeah, it's more like a memoir from his.
Poetic memoir mein photo. So photos are absolutely, they gel very well with the concept of a poetic memoir. What I have in mind is a little different. It doesn't work on the autobiographical level much. At least I hope it doesn't, because so I don't know. I mean, I haven't actually thought of adding photos to it at all, in fact.
I think Sumit was asking because we know you have 80 photographs that you have not used in this book.
and after that also I've taken photos, right? So
yeah,
more. The corpus has grown. Yes, I also want a full-length photo book out. A full-length photo book out, but that I want to be photojournalism. because photo books are, they have to have some archival quality, right? Because they're very expensive and they're big, bulky door stoppers, right? Photo books are big. So if you want, and also I want to prove myself as a photojournalist because I have trained in it, right? So at some point, I do want to do a full-length photo book, which means something like, at least 150 pages. So a lot of photos.
Wow, that's something to look forward to.
150 A4 size pages, at least. So that's a double-sided. So that's a lot of photos. So, it's worth thinking about. But again, that is not planned. Right now, I'm really focusing on the, full-length collection.
Also, things will have to open up for you to go out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to tell COVID stories. Better photographers than me, people who are full-time photojournalists, they are doing stellar work. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. So I don't want to tell photo stories with the camera. Poems is different. Then that is personal. So that doesn't, but in photography, I don't want to tell COVID stories. Let others do it. I'll try to figure out something else.
I'm sure whatever comes out will be great.
Thank you so much. Very kind.
Any last questions? Anybody?
One question.
Swati.
How do you choose for what audience you want to write or take photographs for? Because you have to decide which audience is going to look at it, right?
Yeah. Difficult question. See, I think that to some extent, okay, for poetry, I don't think of an audience. And I'm very glad to do that, right? I don't know if I could write poetry if I had a reader in mind. But photography, yes, because I come from a photojournalistic training, I kind of have my work oriented towards a particular kind of reader, a viewer, right? So fine art, photography, there is a different viewership. Photojournalism is a different viewership. The kind of work I'm doing is more along photojournalistic or photorealistic, whatever you call it. So there, yes, I am looking at a specific audience purely because they like what I do, or they would be more likely to view what I do. But poetry, no, I don't think of an audience. But again, is it really possible for us to be unaffected by what we read, what our peers are doing, what is considered infra-dig for the mores of the times? So for instance, I have never seriously written a poem that rhymed. So if I claim that, no, I never think of a reader, then why haven't I written a poem that rhymed? It's a valid question, right? So the answer is that I'm a product of my times. And I see what's happening around me. And although I don't really think of a reader when I'm writing poetry, I do think in terms of relevance and freshness, right? But that is not the same as thinking of a reader.
The reason why I ask is because for photojournalism, it would depend on, especially for the print version of the book, the thickness of the paper, how big is the paper going to be, the page going to be, is it going to be a copybook, or is it going to be something that somebody's going to read on a book, read in a
public
transport?
Absolutely. No, that's a great question. And with poetry, you don't have to think of those things, right? It's pretty much, that the poetry collection in India is going to be half the size of an A4 page. if you fold an A4 page in two, then that is the size of your poetry book. Demi, I think it's called. I don't know what it's called. I think it's called Demi. A photo book mein, you have to think of all these things, and you not only have to think of whether the paper, like you said, paper thickness. You have to think of glossiness of paper. You have to think of acid-free chahiye paper ki acid chahiye paper mein. You have to think of archival quality kya hai paper ka. You have to think of what is going to be the overall cost. So you have to think of marketing also and printing also, which is a headache. Yeah. So I'm glad I found a traditional publisher who took care of most of it for me. And I was also happy to tell them, listen, you take some decisions and then you get back to me and we'll talk. But I also insisted that it should be an art paper. Because, that much I knew that, you have to have art paper for good photo reproduction. I see a lot of comments in the chat box. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So what I planned to say something. I forget now. Just a parting thing, which is yeah, that's pretty much it. But one thing is that I do believe that none of these photos have been manipulated. They have been edited, obviously. So they have been converted to black and white also. But elements have not been added. Elements have not been removed. That has not been done. I don't believe in it. And there are contexts in which that is industry practice, right? So, but again, street photography, it is frowned upon to manipulate your photos. In fashion photography, it is mandatory to manipulate your photos. But fortunately not in my line.
But the authenticity of that experience very much comes through the collection. As you go through it, you kind of walk with the photographer, and it's very authentic. Even while reading it, it comes across as a very real experience.
Thank you so much. But again, that again is a gray area. Not for me, okay, not for me, because I do digital photography, which is very photorealistic, right? So what you see is probably what you will get on the screen. But there are a lot of people who today also work with film. And in fact, film photography is making a miniature comeback. Now the problem is, or I don't know if it's a problem, but the situation is that the way a film photograph looks depends on so many things, including the kind of film you're using. So two people taking the same photo with different kinds of film in the same kind of camera might come up with radically different looking photos, straight out of the box. So what these clever chaps do is they shoot a lot of film, right? So they know that ye film ka ye light mein ye effect aayega. So they match their film to their mood. I'm not kidding you, okay? You see YouTube, you'll find lots of these guys, right? So if they're feeling a particular way, then they'll choose that kind of film.
Which is an added layer of manipulation, basically.
But it is and it isn't manipulation. Or it is manipulation and it's authentic. Now, what do you say to that? You can't. I don't know what to say to that. I don't know how to react to that. Because that is not my context. But so you see a lot of there's a lot of I don't know, ambiguity, you can say, to what should have been a very straightforward art, which is you open a hole and then you let light in and then something captures that light. But there's a lot of ambiguity in that, particularly film photography. If two people or the same guy at the same place in the same light with different films will produce radically different results, then what is authenticity? It is only an opinion.
Just perception then.
Yes. I don't know. I've babbled a lot, so hopefully some of that was I was coherent in at least some bit of it.
You're very coherent, very illuminating. I think like a camera lens, a lot of our thoughts have also, and some of Suhit's light has entered our minds.
No. Please.
No, but that is precisely why I liked your collection, like meeting you at TQT, because there is like poetry is so freewheeling and so eccentric, but there's a particular method to your madness because of the technical aspects and because you're working with a machine. And that was precisely why I was more interested in your craft, because like I said, there's a method in that madness, and I just wanted to peek behind the magic curtain. So
Thank you. Very thank you for very patiently and kindly and receptively listening.
Because a formal gratitude is necessary. Thank you, Suhit. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I know our interactions have been very sparse, but it has always been very inspiring. And I always wanted to have this conversation with you, and I just thought I'll freeload to Pune Writers Group. Be generous, let them also be a part of the conversation.
So this is a wonderful idea. It's always it kind of reinvigorated a lot of things in my head which were dormant. So thank you guys so much for this.
Thank you. It's been very illuminating and informative. Thanks a lot. Yeah. I'm quite inspired.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So
that was a brilliant session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that you liked it.
Thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, Pune Writers Group.
Just a reminder, tomorrow we have a writing session at 12 o'clock. And on Monday, 7:45 p.m., we are reading and discussing The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. So whoever is interested, please be there.
There's still time to
Bye-bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye,
sir.
sir. Bye.
Yeah.